Hey Rufaro, I finally found you.
Hi, Taviso.
Yeah. What got you to the point of penning this article? What have you seen? What
Mm-hmm.
have you felt at this point?
Mm, mm. Yeah, so that was really two things. And the first was, just my weekly traveling to my parents' house to visit. And, because I'm in Midrand and they're in Krugersdorp, the quickest way is the N14. And just driving on the N14 every week and seeing this giant billboard, right? That was put up by a betting company, right? And I think it was talking about how if you go on their site and you sign up, that site is zero rated, right? So that was kind of the pull, right? If you're bidding with us, you're not going to have to pay for any associated data costs. But I thought it was quite interesting, right? The positioning of that billboard, how large it was. It's the biggest billboard on that highway, and how it's been there for the past 2 years, right? So that was kind of my first reaction to my immediate environment around online gambling. And then a little closer to home, one of my family members, a young person at that, had also gotten into this online gambling via the apps, right? And had started to notice kind of the trend of them not having money, constantly on their phone depositing money into this app. And so I think it was those two things in my environment that made me kind of think, is there a universality to this? And maybe the third factor to that is, having had parents who are actually in the casino industry growing up, right? So I had a little bit of a purview to gambling as a whole. But from the, conventional casinos, that people walk into, was really interested to see, how is online gambling specifically affecting the youth demographic in South Africa. So that was kind of the genesis of why I wanted to write the article.
So quite something quite personal, close to home, and you
Yeah,
seeing what's happening outside.
yeah,
You said he was family members young.
yeah. About maybe 3 years younger than I am. So a millennial
Yeah,
Gen
yeah,
Z. Yeah, so still quite
yeah.
young. Yeah.
A lot of people tend to think of gambling as like older people in the
Mm,
casinos and very old school and traditional.
mm,
And I've been interviewing people, right?
yeah.
And I've been interviewing, including really young people.
Mm,
I'll tell you a little bit later about something shocking I found. Uh,
yeah.
but while doing this, I
Mm,
have been sort of torn. Part of me thinks, am I blowing this out of proportion? Am I
mm-hmm.
overthinking this? Is it just something normal and I'm thinking too much about it?
No, absolutely not. I mean, gambling has been there, since time immemorial, right? And I think media has played a part in kind of, I guess, showing one specific demographic as perhaps being a little bit more inclined to be gamblers. But I think, across the spectrum, of course, you have kind of a very engaged demographic, right? And they'll have key characteristics. But ultimately, I think gambling takes place across the board. I think what has made it a lot easier, or what has been maybe a specific entry point for young people specifically, and not just in South Africa but across the continent, right, is the gamification of gambling, right? So traditionally you would have to walk into a casino, right, or maybe a pub that had a gambling license, and so they could have a slot machine, right, or a roulette, right, in their establishment. And now folks can just access, any gambling platform via their phones, particularly, or online via their laptops. So the gamification of gambling, I think, is what has really been key in kind of luring the younger generation and the younger demographics specifically. And I think alongside, what we're seeing with the internet and the use of social media, I think, the concurrence of, kind of those two phenomenon have really kind of then solidified the younger demographic as being a key target market for gambling or betting organizations and companies.
In layman's terms, when you say gamification, what are we talking about? What do we see?
So we're talking about, anything that you're able to access on an app or online on your phone, right? Or you can access it on the net, right? That's what we're talking about, gamification, right? Quick access. There's a little bit of a data structure that's been built around it, right? So that you can have a so-called better user experience, right? But engaging online, um, I guess in layman's term, the medium through which people are now gambling, right, is what we're kind of referring to as the gamification of gambling. Whereas many, many years ago, the only way that you could, be gambling in a formal sense, that is, right, is you would actually have to walk into a physical establishment that either has or doesn't have a license to have slot machines and tables and such. Yeah.
So I'm a regular South African walking about doing my thing. Why should I be worried about this?
Um, I think it's a good question, but I think one, the premise of that question is that, this is something kind of far removed that isn't already affecting you in some shape or form, right? But outside of conventional gambling and walking into a casino and even the gamification, right, being able to access it on the net and online, even if you look at, classic driving around any kind of township, let's say, you see people playing dice on the corner, that's gambling, right? Or playing cards, right? Poker for money, that's all forms of gambling, right? So it's also not kind of this removed concept. It exists in very different forms, sometimes a little bit more formal or informal, right? But nonetheless, I think gambling is actually quite prevalent, right, across our different communities. I think just the form in which it takes is sometimes what then differs. But to your point, as a South African, why should you be worried, right? Gambling addictions are an actual legitimate, valid thing, right? So I think in my article, I talk about how there's sort of a familiarity with kind of well-known addiction. So we can accept that someone has an addiction to alcohol or other substances, right? But when we talk about other addictions, whether it's an addiction to food or sex, like I say in the article, it's a little bit more confounding for people, right? They don't readily accept that as a legitimate addiction, right? But in the same way that those are and can be very legitimate addictions, so too is gambling, right? Which is why even if you look at gambling boards and the residing regulatory authorities, right, over gambling in specific areas, they're mandated to kind of look at that aspect of, how do we make sure that individuals who are making use of our services, there's a gambling responsibly, kind of mandate that they have. The degree to which that is actually effective or helpful is questionable, right? But there's an element around acknowledging that gambling addictions exist. There are people who have, and I've seen it, or at least seen it through my parents' perspectives as folks who were in the casino industry and in middle management as I was growing up, folks who would come into the casinos and they would gamble their lives away, right? And one individual I remember, my mother being extremely distraught at some point. We were still living in the Eastern Cape. There's a casino there. I don't know if it's still called this by the same name, but it's called Hemingway's Casino. And, one of the VIP clients who would come in every month, spend a bunch of money, had literally gambled away the mortgage money, his kids' school fees money, and had absolutely nothing. And his wife had actually called my mom in the morning and she had said, I just wanted to let you know that he committed suicide, right? And that was extremely upsetting for my mom, of course, right? Being in that environment, and that was what was work for my parents, right? Who at the time had O levels or A levels and, hadn't gone to varsity to kind of become these professionals. And so, they had found themselves in the casino industry in management and, that was their source of income. But kind of observing the effect that it had on my mom's own, psyche, just seeing people coming in and spending all of this money and having their lives literally, materially changed, right, as a result of gambling. That was something that I held at the back of my mind when I was writing this article, right? So it has real life implications, and beyond what folks who are gambling or who have gambling addictions lose in the process, right, as a result of this addiction, it's also the people around them that are affected, right? So inevitably, when a gambling addict runs out of their own money, right, they then have to kind of, rely on alternative ways to source funds in order to keep this habit going, right? And that could be very unhealthy, right? So it could then be stealing, right? Manipulating family members, and using them, right, as a crutch in terms of kind of financially sustaining this habit. And of course, outside of the material aspect of that addiction, there's also kind of the interpersonal relationships, right? Whether it's with family, with friends, the dynamic at a workplace, if someone is employed, those relationships and those setups start to deteriorate over time as this person becomes more and more entrenched in this gambling addiction. So that's just one, sort of dimension to why we should care, right? It's not just kind of affecting the sole individual who's engaging in these behaviors, but it has a profound effect on the surrounding community and the folks that are supporting those individuals in one way or another.
As an epidemiologist, are you seeing this as sort of I don't know, a public health crisis potentially?
I I don't know. I think that's a good question. I haven't looked at any data, which is also kind of one of the key areas around this, right? The data that actually exists. And I mean, it could potentially have, everything is connected and public health doesn't exist, right? In isolation, we talk about the social determinants of health. So, where someone lives, their income, what they have access to, and has a profound effect, right, on their access to just health in general. So I do think it could be a factor that, given some time, we might have to start considering in a very real way. What that timeline actually looks like, I don't know. I can't even make, extrapolations to that end. But again, maybe to go back to that data piece, I think when I was going back to my article and actually rereading what I had written, because it's been a while now, just saw, I think, the last kind of reporting, at least public reporting, because these big organizations, whether it's the online kind of gamified organizations, right, or whether it's the traditional casino setups, they all have data on their target markets, right? They just choose not to share that data publicly. There is a little bit of data that they're mandated to share publicly, but not a ton, right? So they have key insights into the demographics that they are engaging, right? And even in a more targeted way, right? Who are the specific people within a particular demographic we're going to target because of certain vulnerabilities, right, and predispositions that they might have, right, that will make them a lot more vulnerable to engaging in a behavior like gambling in a non-responsible way, right? And so even when I tried to kind of reach out to Betway, Hollywood Bets, all of these organizations, when I was writing the article and saying, can you share some data around the demographics, right? How many South Africans, are engaging on your platforms? How many of them are between 18 and 35? As I was asking these questions, right, I already knew they were not going to come back to me and give me this data, right? It's something that they're going to keep kind of, behind closed doors. But I think there should be a strong push, especially when we start to think about stakeholders like governments, right, who are responsible for the citizens, right, within their broader mandate, around sharing that data and taking a look at that data. Because I think once we start seeing the numbers, then that will also give us a better sense of how these strategies, right, are being formulated in terms of who do we target, where do we go, right? Because you also see kind of a trend of a positioning of these big online platforms in particularly poorer communities, right, or lower income communities, and that's very intentional, right? In my article, I referred to one of the BBC documentaries that I had watched coincidentally at the time, and I think it was taking place in Uganda, or rather, it was set in Uganda. And it was a young person who was talking about the infiltration of these gambling companies in very poor communities in Uganda, right? And so that's a very targeted strategy, but that's also data led, right? They have the data that informs them and says that these particular communities we'd do well, right? For a number of reasons. And so I think there should be a bigger push just for us to have visibility over that data, and then we can actually start doing a little bit more well-informed research around what are the potential effects of this long term, right? And to your point around, could this potentially become a public health crisis? It could be, but without that data, right, we don't really know what we're dealing with, and to the extent, right, this is actually a problem not just in South Africa but the broader continent as well. So yeah, those are some of my reflections to that end. Yeah.
So I'm just thinking about that. If I want to take you back again to like the time you're penning this article in 2022, I've been reading about the mandate of the National Gambling Board, for example, all of the Gambling Act and the updates to it, the concerns of the Department of Trade and Industry, and I have to concur. A lot of what I'm finding is speculation. No one is certain about the numbers. No one is
Yeah.
certain about how prevalent this is and the penetration in different demographics. And I don't know. Hollywood Bets could tell us something, but
Yeah.
clearly they won't. and and I'm wondering, when you were penning that article, what are some of the surprises that came? Like, I mean, you've never dealt with this thing, at least not in that capacity of like writing, studying it. What are some of the surprises you found? Some of the things that made you think, "Whoa, what the hell?"
Um, I don't know if I'd call them surprises, more so as just things that exist in the environment that you're sort of aware of, but maybe not as consciously, right? So one of the individuals that I interviewed, she talked about, she grew up in an environment where a parent was gambling, right? And so she already had kind of access to these environments quite early on. But it was such an interesting sad conversation that she says kind of the trigger point for her in a very real way was an advertisement that was made on radio, right? And that was a couple of years ago, but even now, right? And I don't listen to radio all that much anymore, but I know when I did, right? A lot of radio is, in terms of revenue generation for the stations, is through partnerships with many organizations, and a lot of them can also be these betting organizations, right? So there'll be constant snippets that are being looped throughout the day talking about Hollywood Bets or Lucky Star, whatever it is, right? Betway is a big one. And I think that particular interview just really highlighted in a very profound way, right, that there's an element of, what do we owe to, I guess, the broader community, right? In terms of a responsibility, right? So you yourself might not be the betting organization. You're not the one who's actively, in a very direct way touting the service offering but by having an advertisement on radio, something to which broadcasters are speaking to and punting to, right? To all kinds of communities, right? Regardless of their predispositions, how they've been primed perhaps in childhood, or existing gambling addicts that are listening to the radio and hearing this, right? And it's reinforcing this idea that I need to be on Betway, I need to be on this, I need to be on that, right? I think for me, the question there was, what responsibility does radio and TV and just broader media, right, have towards citizens in the messages that they're putting out there, given that not a lot of data exists, but we know that there is a growing societal problem with gambling, even just outside of, the online gambling side of it. We know that there's something to be said about gambling, particularly in more vulnerable, resource constrained settings, right? And the profound effect that it has on families and broader communities, right? So that was one thing that kind of was brought to the fore for me, because ultimately, you know, when you're driving or whatever you're doing and you're listening to the radio, we hear a lot of these advertisements, but because they become so normalized, right? Or you'll see a billboard as you're driving along the highway, as I did initially, right? And unless you kind of really stop and pause and you say, hey, do we have a bigger responsibility here around the
Yeah.
messaging, right? And who
Mm.
is behind that messaging? It really just quickly becomes a norm. So I think that was one of the things. And I think the second thing is really just around the regulation aspect, right? So the conventional kind of, you know, gambling within casinos, who themselves are also to, you know, moving towards gamification, right? Because you're not necessarily going to always, you know, be getting that foot traffic. Like if you think about the COVID-19 pandemic, where folks couldn't go anywhere, let alone the casino, they actually were really hard hit, right? And I was, you know, as a child of parents who used to work in that industry, was quite interested to hear my mom talk about, you know, just the revenue, you know, and how that was hit in terms of Togo Sun, which is one of the big players, and Southern Sun as well. They were doing poorly and they've been struggling, you know, to get back into
Mm.
it. But they're also trying to kind of diversify their revenue streams, right? Because they're trying to hedge if we can't get people through the door and actually sit at a slot machine or sit at a table. How else can we be generating that revenue, right? So there's also big incentive for them to, you know, funnel some of their resources towards that. So we're going to see this start to expand a lot more, right, outside of some of the players that exist right now. But that regulatory piece is really important, right? Because casinos currently, at least in this country, right, function within quite strict regulations in terms of their gaming license, what they can and can't do, some of the things that need to just actually be in a casino, right? Just for them to even have that license issued to them, and the instances where that license can be revoked, right? But when you look at the online space, right, because it is a newer space, there isn't as much regulation, or at least the regulation isn't clear. And so long as regulation and policies are not clear and that's not communicated very clearly to the public and also supported by the government, right, and also other
Yeah.
stakeholders, civil society, and the rest, right, it allows these companies to really run rampant, because unless you actually hold them accountable to an existing piece of policy, a framework, a regulation, there's nothing that actually kind of mandates them to act responsibly or to act in specific ways, right? And so, up until we have very clear regulations, right, or the public is aware, right, and the media is aware of how we're attempting to, at least in this country, regulate that space a lot more formally, right, and in a lot more kind of a tighter way. I think what you're going to be seeing is very big predatory pushes by these companies, because they're going to be trying to maximize on the time where none of these policies or these regulations are really existing,
Mm.
or are being enforced in a very material way, right? And that's going to have, of course, far reaching consequences for the broader public, because there isn't a kind of regulatory protection, right, that comes from
Yeah.
having very set things in place. Yeah, so I would say those are the two things.
Let's make as much money as we can while we can
Yeah,
before the
yeah,
regulation kicks in. Yeah. I think
absolutely.
to your point, I found it to be. I was a little bit surprised by how pervasive gambling culture is, and I think
Yeah,
part of it is if not a result of, at least correlates with the lack of proper like binary black and white regulation.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and in 2008 there was a bill to make online gambling legal, but leave sport betting as legal. But in practice, it hasn't really played out that way, right? And so
Yeah,
one of the surprises that I've come across, maybe a shock, because I had not anticipated this, is uh,
yeah,
kids in high school who are sport betting
yeah,
online. I mean, I got a chance to interview two 18-year-olds, and they're just telling me about how widespread it is at school. Like
yeah,
it's part of social activity. They all sit around, talk
yeah,
about the Kaiser Chiefs game, how much they made, how much they
yeah,
lost. It
yeah,
sounds all fun and games for them, but I'm not sure we should be at that place where teenagers are betting on sport. As
yeah,
innocuous as
yeah,
it might sound, um, I think we're in trouble, is what I think.
yeah. Absolutely. And it's not innocuous, right? If you look at the broader picture, right, and where that kind of leads up to. And it's sort of a get them while they're young strategy, right? And like I said, again, it goes back to having very targeted strategies. And when you know that a large part of our population is going to have access to your platforms, right? Because they're online, they're engaging on social media. A lot of these platforms are also zero rated, right? So it's not costing them oftentimes any data, costs in that regard. So it's very easy for them to access, right? So you have someone in high school who then goes into varsity, who then starts working, and at no point are we having any kind of interventions, right? Saying that, hey, this should not be a thing. And with a lack of data combined with the lack of, really strong regulations and policies, it's a recipe for disaster, right? And what are the psychological implications, right, of someone starting very young and engaging in a very addictive behavior by the time they're in their 30s or their 40s? Can you imagine the ramifications of that, right? And that's the danger of not really kind of keenly looking at some of these societal issues as they start cropping up, right? Or as they start becoming a lot more prevalent, because it starts becoming embedded in the social fabric, right?
Yeah,
And in the culture. And when something
yeah,
becomes entrenched in culture, it's very, very difficult to address because it's become normalized, right? In folks' mind, especially at a young age, and you're like, but this is normal. We did this in school, and of course, that's that we often see kind of the more profound effects of an activity, a behavior, and exposure, right? As we say in public health, far down the line when it's a little too late, right, to start kind of having preventative interventions. So yeah, you're right. It's absolutely something that we should be worried about, because if folks are engaging in this in high school, right? What more when kids who are in primary school but transitioning to high school also start gambling, right? Because it's something that, that they start hearing about, or they likely have friends who are in high school. Maybe you have folks who are in grade 6, grade 7, and they have friends who are in grade 7 and 8, right? And so inevitably, those demographics are going to be mixing and mingling with one another, and they're going to
yeah.
learn those behaviors. And so
Mm.
it's extremely worrying, right? Yeah, and I think just in terms of a lot of the challenges that the youth are facing, specifically in this country, when we think about unemployment and even unemployment amongst graduates, right? Folks who've gone to school and they've done tertiary education, and there's this promise of you'll have a job, you'll be able to sustain yourself, and inevitably the family back home, right? As is often the case for black kids or young black people, it exacerbates, right, the societal condition, right, especially when it comes to just issues around finances, right. So yeah, it's an incredibly important topic, right, to be discussing, but not at an abstract conceptual level, right. It's happening right now. People are
Mm.
engaging in those behaviors. These companies have 2-3 year outlooks on how they're going to be engaging key demographic populations in South Africa and the continent as well. And it's not just companies within the country, but it's also companies abroad that are looking at Africa and saying, hey, let's go to South Africa, let's go to Uganda. This company has done well, we'll probably be able to position ourselves in this way. And if they're thinking about this in a longer play sort of sense, then we really need to already be doing that active advocacy around who are the key stakeholders who should be speaking about this, who should we be engaging from a regulatory perspective, what social protection can we offer citizens, especially young people, how can we get schools roped in, right? Because a lot of young folks are spending a lot of their time at schools, right? So how do we get them in as a key advocacy player, to start addressing that at a very young level, right? Whilst kids are in engaging in these social activities. Yeah, and so there's a chain of stakeholders, well, at least along that kind of value chain, that we need to be engaging in a very meaningful and intentional way, because these players are also looking at their strategies in a very intentional way, right? And in a very predatory way. And if we don't get ahead of it, I think we're going to see an exponential rise in just the number of kids, the number of young people using these platforms, but in a way that is destructive, right, to their lives. amid other existing, societal conditions, particularly within South Africa.
Oh, thank you so much, man. I don't want to take any more of
Yeah.
your time, but it's quite
No, it's okay.
um I found this quite well, the reason I decided
Yeah.
to track you down. No, my God, I'm glad I
Mm-hmm.
found you. I, the reason I decided to track you down is because when I tried to read about this and find out whatever I
Yeah.
could about this, there was so little
Yeah.
to find,
Yeah.
especially by South Africans in South Africa.
Yeah.
And I was shocked by that, which is
Mm.
partly why I was doubting myself. Am I blowing this out
Yeah.
of proportion? You know?
Yeah.
Um, and then I read your article and I thought, okay, maybe I'm a little bit sane
Mm. Yeah.
in all of this, and I think the way you've explained it to me and what you've
Yeah.
also described what you think should happen, at least
Yeah.
in terms of how we should position ourselves and
Yeah.
in terms of regulation, it reminds me a
Mm-hmm.
lot of it reminds me a lot about the tobacco industry and what they've been
Yeah. I
through
was about to say,
when
yeah. Yeah.
when it
Yeah.
comes to the regulation and how
Yeah.
pervasive that was in society, and basically the global movement against tobacco is paying
Yeah.
off actually.
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
but at the same time we shouldn't forget how big these companies are.
Mm.
These
Mm.
this like the industry is huge, and if you go back to tobacco industry, they were suing governments
Yeah.
around the world, you know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's I suppose what I'm trying to say is, and this does not look like an easy thing to deal with,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
basically. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not. And I mean, the tobacco one is a great one, right? Because I think it remains kind of an example for the ages, right? How smoking was advocated for by doctors, right? At a certain point, because we didn't have the data around the effects of smoking but as the research was building up, that pivotal epidemiological study, right, around the effects of smoking and potentially lung cancer is really what kind of set the tone, right? And then the medical community was kind of onboarded, but then now it was the rest of the world, right? The government is saying, well, tobacco is a big, profit generating industry that is great for our economies, it creates jobs, and all of these arguments that still are used right now when tobacco companies are arguing, for, I guess, greater carte blanche in certain countries, right? And there has been a great tussle, particularly with governments, right? Because tobacco companies have money and they are very litigious. So they are very willing to go to court and fight it out. And of course, even governments are resource constrained, right? They can't afford endless lawsuits, right? And so a lot of the advocacy work, even if I think about, the space that I'm in policy and advocacy, there's a program team, that's part of our foundation that is just around tobacco, right? And part of that has been the countries that still need to have certain policies and legislature in place, right, with regards to tobacco. There's a fund that's actually been created to support governments because they know inevitably tobacco companies are going to take them to task in the courts, right? So it's saying we know that this is an issue, and so we're already saying here's access to funds, right, that you can tap into when you decide to kind of move on these policies, and then the tobacco companies come knocking and they say, let's go to court, right? But it's taken kind of understanding the ecosystem of players, right? Understanding, yes, the folks who do work on tobacco farms, and that is a form of employment, right? Because that's something that you can't get around of. So how do we address that part, right? How do we move policy and regulations, right? How do we address, of course, kind of the main issue, which is the public health, right, effect of tobacco and tobacco products, right, because it's not just the kind of conventional cigarettes now. That kind of has evolved into other markets as well. But it's taken years, it's taken a lot of money, but it's also taken advocacy, efforts across that value chain of different stakeholders, right? And that's, exactly what needs to happen here, right? There's a big advocacy play here, and the government really kind of needs to, one, take it into consciousness that this is an issue, right? And outside of, the initial arguments around how much these, companies bring in, there's also the question around how much of that money is actually staying in South Africa or staying on the continent. And oftentimes these countries are stationed abroad. So the money actually leaves and it's not even contributing, right, to GDP and all of those indicators. So arguments around that it's, great for employment and all of those things is also kind of null and void, right? But the government really, as a protector of citizens and folks who have the mandate towards citizens, right, really need to make it a priority for them. And once it's a priority from them, then we can start engaging other stakeholders. But again, how these things often play out is in actual fact it's usually a bottom up approach, right, where civil society engages, right, and says, hey, there's a problem and it's a big enough problem that the government needs to take it to task, right? And so what we'll probably find is that there are a lot of advocacy efforts at the bottom at a civil society level, and then that needs to be pushed up, right, and be placed on the agendas of the government, and then getting them to be accountable to very real steps to say, let's evaluate, the regulation, the policy space, right? And let's start kind of charting a clearer path in terms of the extent of the involvement of a lot of these companies and organizations in the country. But yeah, I foresee that it will probably be a bottom up approach. But also then ultimately still contingent on the government taking a very, firm stance on this is a problem and so we need to address it and these are the steps that we're going to take to address them, but without their participation, especially on that regulatory piece, we're really going to just see a lot of this predatory behavior escalate over the years, and just given the penetration of social media and just access to the internet on the continent, about 60% of folks have a smartphone, right, in the country. There's a very real danger to that, right, if it remains unaddressed in a very real way, right? So yeah, those are my thoughts on that. Yeah.
Rufaro, thank you so much for making time, and I hope what we're doing here can be part of that bottom up push at some
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.